Hello and welcome everyone to my League Start guide for PoE 3.21 Crucible, featuring my top 3 Minion League starters, utilizing gear worth 1 divine or less. The idea is to use pretty much the same generic League Start gear for all 3 builds, making the mapping footage in the specific subsections more comparable. But before we get started, there are some honorable mentions that didn't make the list, including Poison SRS, a Chains of Command build, and Dominating Blow, which I will be talking about in the Animate Weapon and Absolution section for Dominating Blow respectively. For the gear, we're going to get ourselves a generic Convoking mod that we're then rolling with a Deafening Essence of Fear, and also put on the Minion Attack and Cast Speed crafting modifier. For the shield, we're going to get ourselves Darasus Courage, which gives us elemental resistance and helps essentially pseudo block cap us by giving us block spell damage while on low life, and also gives us block attack damage if we blocked spell damage recently, and vice versa, which is especially powerful for spell damage block because early on we can't really afford to go Tempest Shield just yet. The helmet is a Skullhead, which is a cheap unique that you should be getting yourself as soon as possible. It gives us elemental resistances and gives our minions 25% chance to block attack and spell damage, as well as giving our minions a 10% life recovery on block, which in combination with Bone Offering will make our minions very resilient towards hit-based damage. This doesn't solve anything in terms of dot-based damage, but in general, this in combination with Bone Offering and DK Ward, which I'm going to talk about in a second, will increase the survivability to the point where you can do red tier maps without having to worry about your minions dying constantly. And DK Ward is a notable passive that you can anoint your amulet with. Similar to the Skullhead, it gives our minions chance to block attack and spell damage, while also giving them life recovery on block, while also being very cheap, since Sapir, Verdant, and Teal are also all very affordable, even on League Start. For the chest, we're getting a Corrupted 6 link with life and some resistances, and of course the most important modifier, which is Reflect Physical Damage to melee attackers. Definitely don't forget about that one. For the gloves, we're getting Grip of the Council. This is a very powerful minion item in general, as long as your minions at least start out with some base physical damage, which is all minions except for the Flame and Lightning Golem. You can profit from this item. All of that at the cost of reduced mini movement speed, which isn't great, but it's manageable. The other items are similar to the chest, in the sense that we are looking for life, resistances, and some stats, with the boots being the exception because we also want movement speed for obvious reasons. On the jewelry, we would like to have a free suffix, so we can put on the elemental resistance, minion elemental resistance, double crafted modifier, which helps both us and our minions in topping off our resistances. The flasks are pretty much cookie cutter. We're looking for a life flask that removes bleeding and corrupted blood, Rumi's Concoction as soon as you can afford it. Before that, just go with a generic granite flask, a Quicksilver flask with additional movement speed, a Quartz flask for the phasing, which really helps when mapping, and some increased armor modifier, and an Amethyst flask to increase our chaos resistance. And the last modifier, in this case, I went with shock effect, but you can pretty much put on anything. Now the main difference between the 3 builds are the Ghastly Eye Jewels, at least in terms of gear. The difference between the Ghastly Eye Jewels is the secondary added damage, so the non-physical damage. This is specific to every build and is based on the main damage type. So for Absolution, it would be Lightning. For Chaos Animate Weapon, it would be Chaos. And for the cold conversion, Zoomancer, it would be Cold. Now the last build also needs to build enabling uniques, but I'm going to be talking about those in the specific subsection. For the Spectres, we're going with the Carnage and the Host Chieftain to get charges on our minions, and also a third Spectre, which is build specific, meaning I'm going to be talking about that in the subsections as well. For the Animate Guardian, we are going with Relentless Fury, which gives it a culling strike. This culling strike isn't as powerful as the one you would get on Kingmaker because it only affects the Animate Guardian, so it's not as reliable, but it's still a great League Start item. For the helmet, we're going with Learcast for the increased damage. This early on actually beats the newly introduced Blood Price, because Blood Price kind of acts as a weird more damage modifier, and early on we simply don't have that much damage. So the 50% increased damage from the Learcast just ends up being better, at least in the beginning. For the gloves, we're looking for a Hunter-influenced pair with either a chance to unnerve enemies for Absolution, or the chance to intimidate for the other builds. For the boots, we're going with Wake of Destruction, which gives our Guardian lightning damage, movement speed, and the ability to drop Shock Ground, which isn't super reliable, but it's just an added benefit early on. For the chest, we're going with Zendav's Cassock, which Chaos caps our Guardian early on and gives it the ability to create Consecrated Ground when block, which in itself is already powerful, but is made even better by using Broken Faith, which will then turn the Consecrated Ground into Profane Ground. And in case you don't know, Profane Ground gives plus 1% flat critical strike chance and minus 10 to all resistances for affected enemies. Now, if you can't afford Broken Faith early on, you can just ignore it, because Zendathis' Cassock alone is powerful in itself, right? The ability for a Guardian to create Consecrated Ground will help top off your minions in general. That's pretty much going to be it for the generic gear, so we can now move on to showcase the specific minion builds. We're going to start with the cold conversion Zoomancer. The build features a vast army of permanent minions, including zombies, skeletons, and carrion golems, and can be leveled as a generic summoner using any minion skills, including the ones we use later in the build. The minions predominantly deal cold damage, which allows them to inflict chill and freeze, which in combination with the vast number of minions that act as blockers, make it a relatively safe build to play. The build was created in its current form after the changes to Bitter Dream were introduced in 3.19 by a different content creator, and I'm of course going to leave the links to the original written guide and their YouTube channel in the comments below. I made some small changes to the build. For example, I relegated the Spectres to pure utility again, meaning we're going to use the two Chieftains, which enables charges for this build. We're also going to use a Primal Crush Claw for this build specifically, which you can get from blue plants in Harvest. Relegating the Spectres to utility also frees up one of the links, which they previously shared with Vaal Summon Skeletons, and the support gem we were putting into that link are then obviously increasing the damage of our skeletons even further. The main differences in terms of gear are Bitter Dream, which is where we put our carrion golems and our zombies, which will give both of them effective 6 links. In case you're wondering, there are only 6 links because the inspiration support currently doesn't work on minions because they can't get inspiration charges. And the other build enabling unique is Oberon's Warpath, which makes our skeleton warriors permanently and follow us. In terms of gear upgrades, we're looking for the Ancient Skull, which increases our minions' damage at the cost of them taking chaos damage over time. 20% of their maximum life to be specific, which means you have to invest into minion chaos resistance because it's otherwise not sustainable. We're also going to get ourselves Skin of the Lords for the +2 level of socketed gems. You have to keep in mind that you need to get a Skin of the Lords with the specific color combinations that you need, because the sockets cannot be modified by any means possible. You also need to make sure that the allocated keystone of the Skin of the Lords doesn't brick your build. For example, Chaos Inoculation would be really bad early on because we simply don't have enough energy shield to actually stay alive. Other contenders for build bricking keystones are Vaal because it disables life regen, Blood Magic because it removes all of our mana, which means we couldn't reserve any mana for our auras, and you most certainly don't want to reserve life. There are other things like the Agnostic, which will set our energy shield to 0, and like Mind Over Matter will constantly drain our mana whenever we take damage. I think one noteworthy addition would also be Eldritch Battery, because Energy Shield would then protect our mana instead of our life, which we definitely don't want. You can also get yourself an Anima Stone at any point. This won't really increase your single target DPS by a significant amount, but does represent an additional minion, so more blockers, and will also increase your clear speed. What is, however, important is the Triad Grip. Triad Grip converts physical damage of minions to elemental or chaos damage based off the socket colors of the Triad Grip. And we are going with a 3 green, 1 red setup, because most of the green sockets we're using are offensive auras that we want to link to generosity support. And it is in fact damage optimal to convert only 75% of your physical damage to cold, but having your offensive auras being linked to generosity support, compared to 100% cold conversion without the generosity support on your offensive auras. And the way to make the Triad Grip with this specific color combination is a bit tricky, because the green gems aren't native to that item base. The easiest way is to craft this via the crafting bench. So what you would do is you would craft 3 sockets if it doesn't have exactly 3 sockets already. You then craft 3 green sockets, followed by 4 sockets. And the new socket is most likely going to have one of the native colors of that item base, in this case red or blue. Now, if you don't hit the right color immediately, you can use the 3 socket craft, which will retain the colors of the initial 3 sockets, meaning you don't have to reinvest the chromatic orbs. And you can then craft 4 sockets again, hoping to hit the socket color that you're looking for. Now, while this is most likely going to give you one of the native colors of that item base, you can in theory use it to also introduce a non-native socket color. It's just going to take a lot more tries. In theory, this can be used to make, let's say, 4 green Triad Grip, if you wanted it. In terms of endgame scaling, it is possible in general by replacing the Bitter Dream with a proper minion helmet, so a helmet that features plus levels, socketed gems supported by minion damage, socketed gems supported by hypothermia, socketed spells have plus critical strike chance, socketed spells deal more elemental damage. Those helmets are obviously very expensive. We're talking probably a couple hundred divines, to be honest. So that's already going to be a huge barrier for a lot of people. And the build has other issues that sadly can't be fixed with currency, even if you were willing to spend that much. For example, the skeletons have incredibly low base life, and the skeleton warriors on top of that also have an imperfect block, meaning they take 15% of the hit's original damage when blocking, which in combination with low base life and little to no recovery really does start eating into them quickly. The other issue is, and you might have seen that in the video footage earlier, is that you essentially have too many melee minions, which becomes an issue because minions do actually have collision, limiting their ability to hit the boss because they have to position themselves around them. Even if you have a boss with a very large hitbox, one large enough to enable a second row of minions, you are still going to lose effective DPS because your minions will have to position themselves around the boss, and that will simply take time. Alternatively, you could league start this build and then later ditch the skeletons, transitioning to a physical or cold conversion Karen Golem zombie build. I played something very similar last league, although I did play this build on the Ascendant as opposed to the Necromancer. In general, those builds are great mappers and they're definitely endgame viable. If you compare the Necromancer to the Ascendant has more damage and is a bit faster, but the Necromancer has an easier time scaling minion survivability to the point where you can actually do Ubers because of the bone barrier, which gives our minions more maximum life, which is obviously one of the most important factors in minion survivability. In case you want to see what an endgame version of such a build could look like, I'm going to leave the link to my cold conversion Karen Golem Zombie Ascendant in the links below, and I'm going to be adding a endgame PoB for the Necromancer version of that build in the comments of that video. So if you're interested, go check it out. Which brings us to our next build, Absolution. Absolution is a tried and tested league starter, functioning at all gear levels without needing specific build-enabling uniques, and you can start using it from the end of Act 1 onwards. The skill has two components, a spell that deals damage and applies a debuff to enemies, and a minion that can be summoned conditionally. These Sentinels of Absolution are summoned after killing an enemy with that debuff, or occasionally when hitting a rare unique enemy with a 25% chance, which enables bossing for this build. In case you already have 3 Sentinels, which is the maximum amount, additional procs don't spawn new Sentinels, instead they refresh the duration of existing ones, which is nice. If you compare Absolution to Dominating Blow, you're going to find that they are similar in function, meaning that they deal damage and apply a debuff, and if enemies die while being affected by the debuff, their corpses will transform into Sentinels. Absolution has fewer total summons, which is better because it means we need fewer hits. The minion is also ranged, which is better in terms of DPS, because the minions don't need to move around as much. Same is true for the spell itself. This is not only safer for us, but it also means that we don't need accuracy, which is what you need to get for Dominating Blow, because it's not only melee, but it's also an attack, meaning you can theoretically miss. Realistically speaking, you're going to have to get yourself the hits can't be evaded modifier on your weapon, which not only blocks a modifier, but also costs you 3 Exalted Orbs, which is noteworthy, at least on League Start. Absolution also has its full power against bosses, whereas the potential of Dominating Blow is somewhat reduced because of the inability to summon magic and rare sentinels against bosses. The Sentinels of Absolution do have a downside. They only have half the duration of the Sentinels of Dominance, But since the spell is ranged and you have fewer sentinels, they should still be easier to maintain. Looking at the Vaal versions of the skill gems, Vaal Absolution greatly increases clear speed, which is nice for mapping and as such very important for a league start scenario where this is the main content we're doing. But I do think that Vaal Dominating Blow is probably better in terms of the increase in damage against bosses. I don't think it makes up for all the disadvantages. Overall, I think that Absolution is the much better ability, and you should only try out Dominating Blow if you have never played it and really just want to see how it is. The gear for Absolution is exactly like the gear I showed initially. The secondary added damage on the Ghastier jewels is lightning damage. For our third Spectre, we're going to go with the Baronite Cleric, which projects an aura in a small AoE around it, giving a % of physical damage as extra lightning damage and increased chance to shock. Sadly, this minion currently doesn't exist in PoB, which is why I put in the Baronite Preacher as a placeholder. And I also mentioned that in the notes in case people get confused. Hopefully this minion will be added eventually. In terms of gear progression, you can get yourself extra levels via a minion helmet. Optimally, it also has a free prefix so you can craft maximum life. We're also going to be using a Skin of the Lords in this build because the extra levels really do help scale Absolution's damage. Outside of that, you can pretty much get any item with minion damage, critical strike chance, and attack and cast speed to increase the damage of Absolution further. In terms of scaling, the build can be scaled incredibly well and in a linear fashion into the endgame. The only limiting factor here is currency and pretty much nothing else. Chaos Animate Weapon is a tried and tested league starter as well, and much like Absolution, it functions at all gear levels without specific build enabling uniques. The skill becomes available early in Act 1, but it only becomes relevant as a main skill after Act 4, when we get access to Unleash. Before that, the amount of time it takes to animate all weapons is simply too long, especially when factoring in that they also disappear on load screens, making it mostly useful for powerful enemies as a support tool. The skill animates weapons or lingering blades on the ground, and we can create those lingering blades with Ethereal Knife and Bladefall later on. The skill itself is comparable to SRS and the Animate Guardian weapon from the Chains of Command unique. The reason why SRS didn't make the list is because Animate Weapon does everything SRS does, but better. And this includes more damage, better survivability, the ability to aggro enemies, and the greatly increased duration. And all that at the cost of a 2-button playstyle, which I do understand is off-putting to some people, but you have to keep in mind, the overall amount of actions with an Animate Weapon build compared to SRS will still be much lower due to the duration being 8 times higher. Which brings me to Chains of Command. It requires build enabling uncommon uniques, mainly Chains of Command, and Gravebind on the Guardian, so you can effectively animate the level 20 version of the minion. It also requires a Breathing Jar to get started, which isn't too much of an issue in maps, but turns into a huge problem when bossing. Because for bossing, multiple Breathing Jars and passive charge gain is required to make the build work. And this is made worse by the Animate Guardian's weapon having half the duration of Animate Weapon, meaning even with investment into skill effect duration, you have to resummon your entire minions every 43 seconds and of course on death. All of this requires a large investment in passive points and flasks. The build also can't be scaled proper into late game due to the inability to scale base life of the minions. And this is usually done by scaling minion level, but can't be done with the Animate Guardian's weapon due to the fixed level they are getting from the chains of command. All in all, this relegates the build to maps, or at least map-like content, which I personally find needlessly limiting. Despite the build being more powerful due to the weapon on the Animate Guardian getting Crucible trees, I think the main issues of Chains of Command builds, namely minion survivability and the ability to summon minions, are most likely not going to be properly addressed by that, and as such, I can't recommend playing Chains of Command over a regular Animate weapon build. In terms of gear progression, the most important item to get is the new Severed in Sleep, which now gives us Envy and our minions a 60% chance to inflict Withered on hit, as well as 5% to critical strike multiplier per Withered debuff on enemy, which will make Withering Touch obsolete. And it also ends up being cheaper and better than the upgraded version, United in Dream. Just like on the Zoomancer, we also want to get the Ancient Skull. We also need added chaos damage in order to make this one work, but because of the chaos resistance from Severed in Sleep, we don't need the point in Grave Intentions to chaos cap our minions. We're also going to get ourselves Skin of the Lords. This is because Animate Weapon is the minion that scales best with levels in the game, at least right now. And the same limitations in regards to socket colors and keystones, of course, apply to this build as well. We also want to get ourselves a Triad Grip with 4 white sockets in order to transform all the physical damage to chaos damage. And the way you make this is by doing some Immortal Syndicate, by putting Vorachi into the Research safe house, leveling him up all the way to rank 3, then doing the Mastermind. And in the safe house, after the boss fight, you're going to find a crafting bench that allows you to make between 1 and 6 sockets white on an item, with the average number being 2 sockets. The good thing is, the Triad Grip, even with just 2 white sockets, is already useful for us, because we don't care what happens to the physical damage that isn't converted into chaos damage. Since we're not dealing any poison damage, there is no difference between physical and elemental damage for our build, because we're not actually scaling any of them. Now there's one more thing that I haven't touched upon yet, and that is the newly introduced Vaal skill gem. We've just received confirmation that it actually animates 10 weapons as uniques with a 69% more damage modifier compared to the regular skill, which is of course nice. I'm not quite sure whether this actually counts towards the weapon limit that you have in general. That seems to be the more sensible option. If that's not the case, Vaal Animate Weapon pretty much doubles our damage while being active. Either way though, Vaal Animate Weapon represents a sizable increase in damage while it's active, making Animate Weapon builds even more powerful than they already were. In terms of scaling, Animate Weapon is one of the best scaling minions in the game right now. It scales well from League start to the very end game. And I've played the Chaos Animate Weapon build myself in League of Kalandra, cleared all the content with it, Despite not going as far in terms of gear as I could have, this wasn't really about the build, and more so about Lake of Calandra being kind of mid. I've already updated all the PoBs of this build, and I'm going to leave the link to the build guide and the leveling showcase of the poison version in the comments below, in case you want to check those out. And this was my list of the top league starters, at least how I see the meta right now. Hope you're going to have an awesome time on Friday. I know I will. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave them in the comments below. And see you in the next one.